Hi, this is Cyberman King back again. Of course, you're obviously watching video gameplay of Age of Empires right now, but previously, when I was recording this, I had my microphone muted, and so instead of deleting all the game footage, I decided that I'd read some history, kind of reflecting on ancient Egyptian history. And this book is actually not focusing much on ancient Egypt per se. It's an old copy of mine called Reading the Old Testament, an introduction. It's by Lawrence Boadt, who has since passed. The original edition, when it was first published, was back in 1954, so this book is about 40 years old. They have a more recent edition out that I don't have, that has been edited and added upon. And this book is, it's an introduction to reading the Old Testament. So, if you're interested in reading the Old Testament, the Tanakh in the Hebrew tradition, if you're Jewish, or if you're Christian, of course, this is part of your biblical canon, it's the Old Testament. I recommend it. There are some things that I don't necessarily agree with. The theories, of course, are from the 1970s, earlier, maybe some in the 1980s. But there's some good information here that I'd like to share. And one part is on the second chapter on Egypt. Egypt, of course, is present within the Old Testament, particularly within the books of Genesis and Exodus. So I would just like to read this as I am playing here, as I've forgotten to record my audio. So this is the second chapter. The second part of it is on Egypt, and it seems fitting based on what we're playing right now. This title is here is the Gift of the Nile. So Egypt's history is the story of the Nile and the desert. The Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century BC called Egypt the gift of the Nile. Rainfall was almost unknown, and all life revolved around the waters of the river. It provided drink and irrigation, a highway of communication from its towns, and a cheap means of transportation for goods and trade. In ancient times, as they still do today, the Egyptians lived on and farmed a narrow band of land along the last 1,000-mile stretch of the Nile River, which flowed northward 4,000 miles from Central Africa to the Mediterranean. The ribbon of cultivated grain is never more than 12 miles across, except for its last 100 miles, when it widens into a lush delta area, nearly 160 miles wide. Vast sand deserts surround this little sliver of life, and beyond the river valley, only a few oases exist to support any settled population. In this harsh and seemingly hostile world, one of the greatest of ancient civilizations arose, prospered, and maintained its way of life almost unbroken for 2,500 years, from 3000 BC until 500 BC. Each fall, the river, swollen by melting snow from Kenya, rose rapidly over its banks and flooded the soil with a new layer of silt and fertility for another year. The rhythm of the river divided the year into two parts: the growing season, when the people worked in the fields, and the waiting season, when the land was flooded. In this latter period, most of the farmers were idle, and the pharaohs would use them for their massive building projects. Everything depended on the river. In fact, it was so central to the thinking that Egyptians regularly described northern countries which depended on rainstorms as lands watered by a Nile that flows in the sky. But the desert too was important. It sealed Egypt off from all around her. It created a great sense of self-importance and contentment that often led Egyptian tribes to bemoan the poor foreigners who were not blessed by being Egyptian. High desert ridges formed parallel walls along the Nile Valley, and so Egyptians thought in terms of north and south more than east and west. It also brought home the difference between those who lived in the wide and more open delta area and those who lived along the narrow banks up the river. From the beginning, Egypt was the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt. Around 3000 BC, the king of Upper Egypt, Menes, conquered the Delta people and joined Lower and Upper Egypt into one nation. But from that time on, the pharaohs always used two titles, or two separate crowns, governed two regions. Although African in race, Egyptians were Semitic in outlook, directed more to the rich lands of Lebanon and Palestine for trade, and new ideas to their southern neighbors. Ships and caravans regularly journeyed between the Delta and Asia Minor, bringing wood, horses, dyed wool, and other elegant clothes to Egypt and carrying back ivory, paper, finished chariots, and other woodwork. Egyptian history from 3000 BC down to the time of King David of Israel, about 1000 BC, is traditionally divided into three major periods, which are called the Old Kingdom from 2800 to 2200 BC, the Middle Kingdom 2000 to 1750 BC, which is about where this video is right now, and the New Kingdom 1550 to 1150 BC. Between each of these was a period of chaos. From 2200 down to 2000 BC, rival regions fought for power among themselves. From 1700 to 1550, foreign invaders from Asia and the Hyksos dominated the country. Ever since the time of Manetho, a Greek writer of the 3rd century BC, the history of Egypt has been divided into 30 dynasties. Although there is a lot of confusion in the system and its accuracy is not very high for many periods, but it provides a convenient framework to outline the most important events in Egyptian history. And from here you can describe on the various dynasties. The first two are kind of combined along with the 3rd for 6th, 7th for 9th, 10th for 12th, 13th for 17th, the 18th, the 19th, the 20th, and beyond. And so let me just go to where it is a conclusion. It is then. So all this course of history from 3000 to 1000 BC, I might not get to at this point in time. Perhaps I can do another add-on. There's a lot of stuff. Actually, I will say, okay, I think this is particularly interesting within the 18th dynasty. So the founder of the 18th dynasty, Ambrose I, reunited Egypt as a single nation again about 1550. Under a series of brilliant kings, this dynasty pushed Egyptian borders deep into the Near East and controlled all of Palestine, Lebanon, and most of Syria. It set up naval bases along the coast of Asia, put armed garrison and Egyptian governors in the port cities, and made regular marches of a full army through the territory to show the colors. Because of the excellent communications set up across the Sinai Desert, the pharaohs were able to control the Asiatic states for at least 150 years. The greatest of the 18th dynasty pharaohs was Thutmose III. Under his rule, Egypt reached the greatest power it had ever attained. This was despite the fact that he had contended with an older relative, Hatshepsut, who usurped the title of king for 18 years, from 1486 to 1468, even though she was a woman. It was also the dynasty of Amenhotep IV, which is what this is kind of depicting in the end of this, who is the heretic king, began a radical reform of religion in 1378 BC by attempting to replace the hundreds of Egyptian gods with a single deity worshipped as the sun is visible in the sky, the Aton, or Aton, I should say. He even changed his name to Akhenaton, the beloved of the Aton, and devoted all his energies to internal problems at home, including setting up a new capital city at El Amarna. The Asiatic empire began to slip away, and the people's reaction to the new faith was violent in rejection. His young nephew and successor, King Tut, only a boy king, was forced to restore the old faith. So here we have then this king who introduces monotheism, and it's violently rejected by his successor has to kind of restore. You can kind of see this in some ways with Julian the Apostate, the emperor of Rome, in the mid-4th century, which he reverts back to paganism after being brought into Christianity. Christianity became the norm of Rome at this point in time.